Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen Artisan Lecture Series. My name is Victoria Dengel. I'm the Executive Director of the organization. For those of you not familiar with us, we were founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City. There were artisans at that first meeting, which represented 22 different trades, including carpenters, saddlers, tailors, and silversmiths, among others. Our organization, which this year will celebrate 230 years, continues to serve the people of the city of New York through our educational and cultural programs, which include our Tuition-Free Mechanics Institute, the General Society Library, and this century-old lecture series, of which the Artisan series is a part. The magnificent space you're in tonight is the library of the Society. It was founded in 1820. It's the second oldest library in New York City and one of the city's 3 remaining private libraries. Having said that, we invite you to become members for as little as $35, and our book and periodical collections go back to 1785, so there's a lot to look at. And so tonight, we gather once again to pay tribute to the art of craftsmanship. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen has committed itself to giving voice to internationally known artisans who will talk about the intricacies of their specialized crafts. The mission of the Artisan Lecture Series is to promote the work and art of skilled craftsmen to assist in ensuring their unique knowledge is carried forth for generations to come. Our artisan lectures are possible with the support from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, as well as the generous support of the McQuestion Companies, Peter Panoia Architects, and Bauer and Dean Publishers, and the Friends of the Artisan Lecture Series. And now I would like to bring forward Vanessa Hoheb, who is going to introduce tonight's speaker. Vanessa Hoheb is a fellow artisan who spoke here several years ago to a standing ovation, might I add. And Vanessa will talk to you about our lecture as well as her own strong ties to this organization, which go back, it was discovered about 100 years. So I bring you Vanessa Hoheb.
I look pretty good for that age, huh? Victoria Dengel, Camille Wiart, Karen Taylor, thank you so much for the vital and important work you do for furthering the mission of the General Society. It is very exciting for me to be here on so many levels. My grandfather, Anthony Michella, came to America in the 1900s. He spoke no English, he had no skills. An extended family member, an angel really, sponsored him to study here at the Mechanics Society. He studied for 3 years and he got his degree in architectural drafting, and then he went on to have a successful construction company and built many of the buildings that are still standing in Long Island City today. I grew up in New York City in my father's sculpture studio as an apprentice, learning the skills of the trade. It was one-on-one, 6 days a week, for years. One day I asked my father, how can I ever repay you for opening the door to this wonderful and interesting life? And he said simply, you can't. But what you can do is when an outstanding young student comes through your studio, one who's a real sparkler, you teach them. I met Thomas Donahue at Pratt Institute, where he was earning his degree in arts, and I was in my early years, very early years, of teaching mold making and casting. In a large class of talented students, the quality of Thomas's work, his focus and obvious passion was head and shoulders above the rest. Here was one of those sparklers. Thomas joined us in the New York studio, constantly learning, always contributing. Over the next 40 years, we've worked together on wonderful projects, sometimes side by side and often at a distance, in our studios and in sheds, up on scaffolding for other artists in their studios, and under the glorious roof of the Metropolitan Museum. I've been privileged to work with and learn from many gifted artisans in my life. What is so unique about Thomas is his combination of intelligence and thoughtfulness, his passion for detail, and his ability to connect those details with the whole, while always keeping his eye on the big picture. His consistent ability to refine an idea or a technique, often with just the tiniest tweak, that transforms the work and enables it to go from being very good to being excellent. He understands how and when to add a layer of refinement to the work and take it to that next level. There's a term in Italian, rubare i mestieri, means to steal the mysteries and then you make them your own. Learning lessons from masters both present and long gone, listening with an inner ear. This visceral understanding and approach has been instrumental in Thomas's success. Art is craft transcended. I'm proud to introduce my next level guy, my friend Thomas Donahue.
What an amazing introduction. Thank you, Vanessa. I love you, and I hope to do you good tonight. And with that, I'll start. First off, if this were a workbench and if I was covered in plaster, I would be infinitely more comfortable. It being a podium with a microphone and me in a tie, I'm going to try to be comfortable. The thing that makes it a little bit easier is presenting to this group. It's kind of like preaching to the choir. The General Society, you know, the notion of a society of mechanics and tradesmen is something that I'm very comfortable with. It's my people. I was thinking about, as I was putting the presentation together, if you add to that the mechanics and tradesmen, poets and playwrights, designers and musicians, that sort of defines the population of my life, and a life that I'm very privileged to just be a small part of. I want to thank Karen and Camille and Victoria for the opportunity, and this is a gift to me. I'm one of those folks, you know, they say some people are motivated by light and some people are motivated by fire, by heat. I'm more of a heat kind of motivator, so the fact that there was a deadline of January the 13th really encouraged me to put some thoughts together, and also to take some time to reflect as to where I've been, where I come from, what I've done, and you know, maybe a little bit of what I hope to accomplish. I had a couple working titles for this talk. One of them was Why I Do What I Do, and it used to be across there, and then the other day we took it out because it wasn't quite right. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought about every time I go to a party or meeting somebody new and they say, well, what do you do? I never exactly know how to explain what it is that I do, so I usually explain what it is that I'm doing at the moment, whether I'm working on a jewelry mount or whether I'm working on an interior or whether I'm advising architects. It changes, but in putting all this stuff together, I realized that maybe the best way to describe what I do is I'm a storyteller. And I can't put that on a business card, but it seems to fit really well. It's comfortable for me to say that I'm a storyteller. When I restore something, I'm supporting a story that's already been told. When I'm taking a sculpture commission, I'm helping somebody's story be told. When I'm repairing something, I'm sort of mending a chapter in a story that might be missing that is making a story not as complete as it could be. So I'm going with the idea of storyteller, and that's going to kind of run through the theme here a little bit. Before I get much further into it, everybody knows the expression of living on the cutting edge of technology. I've been described as living on the spreading edge of the 19th century. And the fact that those images are there and that there's buttons for me to push here and that all this works together is largely, I have to thank my friend Mark Lack, who's sitting in the front row here. Mark Lacko's my best friend, and he is the guy who holds my hands through anything technical. The other person is Malia back there, and I thank her for her help as well. I'm told that if I press on this thing here, a little green light will come on. Ooh, it did. I'm ready. So now I'm diving in. It's starting. I thought one of the important things about life as a craftsperson, artisan, artist, is to understand maybe where it began. And I have a little story that I thought I'd tell. And this won't be the prelude to a very long evening, I promise. It'll skip forward very quickly. But when I was 4, my mom and dad gave me a coloring book, and it was called All the Dogs of the World. I think it was the Golden Book Encyclopedia or something like that. And, you know, it was a great coloring book, just big black lines. And I had a favorite illustration. It was of a collie. And I took a piece of paper and I put it in there like a bookmark, so whenever I wanted to go look at the collie, I didn't have to go through all the pages. Well, one day I realized that I could see the image of the collie through that piece of paper. So I took my crayon and I just followed the ghost image of the collie. And I thought that was cool. So I went upstairs. My mom and my aunts were sitting around the kitchen table under like a plume of cigarette smoke. And I showed the drawing. And all of a sudden everybody was saying, oh my God, the kid has got such talent. Look at this drawing. It was, you know, well, I am one of a very, very, very large family. And at the time it was growing. And to differentiate yourself from any of your other siblings in any way was very attractive. So I didn't offer any explanation as to how I came about this drawing. So I'm embarrassed to say that my entire career is based on something of whatever, but what had happened was that I became known as sort of a good drawer, you know. So over the course of the next several years, whenever there was a birthday, whenever there was Christmas, you know, I would get watercolors or newsprint or charcoals or anything like that. And there was one Christmas that, and this is where I get to push the little button, there was one Christmas where I got 2 books. And when I was preparing for the talk, I found a box that I hadn't opened in a bajillion years. And these 2 books were in it. I got these when I was 10 years old. The Art of Origami and Learn to Draw with John Nagy. These 2 things are hugely pivotal, I've decided, in my career. The Art of Origami was an incredibly cool book to me because it came with this small package of 6 by 6 inch pieces of paper, and then there were all of these instructions as how you folded them, how you manipulated these pieces of paper, and without adding anything to them or subtracting anything to them, you could create something that was 3-dimensional. And I thought that was amazing, that you could have this thing, and through manipulation of it, it could become an object. You know, the folds would create highlights, and the recesses would create shadows, and all of a sudden you had, you know, a penguin, a crane, or whatever. I thought this was amazing. Go back to John Nagy. Now, I knew John Nagy was an artist because he had a goatee. And John Nagy, I don't know if it was out in New York. I grew up in Michigan. But out there, John Nagy had a drawing show. And it was about the same era as Jack LaLanne, and with Exercise, and Sherry Lewis with Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. John Nagy would get in front of an easel with a piece of charcoal, and he'd render these roads that would recede into space, or he would render a pond that would sit in its landscape and wouldn't be on its edge. It was amazing. I was completely fascinated by John Nagy and everything that he could teach. The papers that came with the origami, it was the first time I saw anything outside of loose leaf. I mean, the most exotic piece of paper I could get would be onion skin that my mom used to write airmail letters on. The origami papers were brilliant, brilliant colors, intense foils, patterns. They were just the most gorgeous things. I used to lie on the floor and fan the papers out in front of me and decide which paper I would use for which origami regiment. And I would go through this whole process of deliberation. I'd decide this was perfect for this, and then I would say, it's kind of perfect for this, but it would be a little bit more perfect for that. Go back and forth, and I wouldn't fold anything until I was absolutely sure. Years later, I was living in Ireland, and there was a blue cobalt painted cement wall next to the house that I lived in with a vine growing on it. And I did this painting. And when I was going through some slides of work, I realized how close that was to one of the origami papers. It was this intense floriform pattern. So I wanted to include that here. John Nagy's whole thing was shading is the secret to realistic drawing. And I think that would make a lovely t-shirt. What was cool about this to me was the fact that even on the two-dimensional plane, on a piece of paper, that you can make something three-dimensional, a believable three-dimensional reality through shading or through perspective. His whole idea of perspective was way beyond me. I had no patience for those numbers or dotted lines or anything like that. I just thought it was amazing that with a stroke of charcoal in decreasing scale, scattered across a picture plane, that the mind would be convinced that those were telegraph poles, that this was a kind of space that was created. The other thing about this book, and the reason I'm spending a little bit of time on it, was that I found that the more I looked at the pictures, the after, the result picture, the more I became fascinated with what I didn't see. I always thought that if it was a window frame and I could walk up to it and stick my head through it, I wanted to see what was on the left, and I wanted to see what was on the right. Or if it was an action thing, I wanted to see what had just happened or what was about to happen. And I don't know if that's like a predisposition or what, but the desire, the hunger for knowing the complete story, for knowing the narrative behind something, for knowing the story behind something, becomes this thread that goes throughout, if not my career, at least through the way that I try to think through projects, is to wonder why something is correct, to develop a story as to why it's correct. So from here, here's a sculpture that I had done of a tornado. It's actually interesting that the grain elevator on the right recurs again about 25 years later. And John Nagy also talked about how no matter how complicated an image was, it was sort of like the sound of music and do, re, mi. You could always break things down to cones and spheres and cubes. And every now and again, when I get into a real spot with a piece of sculpture and something just doesn't sit right, in the back of my head is, what shape is this thing? And I look to those very, very basic things. I come back to John Nagy and the art of origami a lot more than I think. This is a sculpture of a chimney fire that I did. And this is an extension of that notion that you can take material and create something that's completely different from the material. I can take clay, and if everything goes right, I can make something that neither feels like or looks like clay. I can take something that's heavy, sculpt it, and make it appear to rise, make it appear to have lightness. And a friend of ours, their house burnt down after they had built it, and they were just 2 days away from moving in, and that just was such a powerful story to me that it stuck in my head, and I did this sculpture just of a chimney fire. This is a screensaver. This is a series of paintings that I did that was working with the balance between something that was very humble and utilitarian. I used Rust-Oleum deck paint and then 22 karat gold leaf. And there was a whole series of them. It's going to be up there while I just fast forward to going off to school. When I went through high school, I got an Excellency Scholarship to study at Pratt Institute, and I came out here to New York. That first year, actually I met my friend Mark Lacko that first year. You know, there was a regimen of courses. There was light, color, and design. There was three-dimensional design. There was anatomy. I went through the entire first-year curriculum and enjoyed it, but at the end of it, didn't quite know where I wanted to go from there. And I decided to take a term off. So I went and I got a job as a construction laborer in Manhattan here. Excuse me. Sorry, sound guy. on 26th Street. It was one of the first commercial buildings that was being converted over to residential in what is now sort of fashionable Chelsea. When I was at that job, I met a lot of incredible folks. There was a group of real old world plasterers working on that project. There was a great group of just solid blue-collar tradesmen, you know, HVAC guys, plumbers, carpenters, masons. And then there was my fellow laborers. And the thing that was so interesting to me in that process was, aside from providing some entertainment for the other laborers to see me going up like a plank with a wheelbarrow full of cinder blocks, it was really a cool thing to see how collaborative a project is, how collaborative a piece of architecture is, how collaborative anything is. And I found that in a job site that was run so well, with so much camaraderie, that the project took on a certain kind of joy. And that was something that I took away from that term off. I think it was something that helped me to learn as much as anything that I learned formally at Pratt, the notion of the sheer amount of energy that's expended in doing a thing and how very, very seldom anything is accomplished on our own. When I went back to Pratt to finish up my curriculum the next year, I was introduced to plaster, sort of my material of choice. And I was quite literally introduced to it. There was a guy, Joe Campo, who was a technical advisor in the industrial design department. And Joe was, I like to say he was an older gentleman. I wonder that he wasn't my age now, but at the time he seemed like an older gentleman. And he insisted that you start the day looking at your bag of plaster, saying, "Good morning, plaster," and giving it a little. He thought the material deserved that sort of respect. It does. It was an amazing experience to work with a guy who had that much into the material itself. I decided, after working with plaster for a little while, that I would be interested in mold making. And there was a class beginning mold making with Bruce Hoheb, and decided to sign up for it. And at that time, I forget where in the world your dad was, but he was either in China or Egypt or somewhere. Vanessa was filling in. And like Vanessa said, she was a few years older than myself and light years with more technological skill than I had. But we really clicked. She became my teacher for the course, and that began 40 years of a relationship that, as she described, you know, has been a pretty special one. I have a few slides here that just sort of suggest some of the stuff that Vanessa and our sort of overlapping circles have come across. We worked on a tremendous amount of sculptures. Just literally few years after I had finished art history classes, I was working on some of the objects that I had studied. We worked on a lot of original sculptures that were being cast in bronze, some that were rather transient. The Renoir on the left there was discovered, and it was a clay that had never been fired. As a result, it was incredibly delicate and had to be molded and translated into a more permanent material. The middle piece there is Louise Nevelson's Statue of Liberty. And the piece to the right is Joe Brown's Young Benjamin Franklin at the printing press that's in front of City Hall in Philadelphia. The relationship that Vanessa and I had with her father, her dad had an engineering background. He was a tremendously gifted sculptor himself and had refined an enlarging machine. Now, I don't know if many folks here were at Vanessa's lecture, I think it was 2011, when she talked extensively about enlarging. But it's a pretty interesting process. And we were involved in a number of projects, but probably the most, I wouldn't say influential, I would say the most expansive one was working on a series of de Koonigs. At least the legend is that Mr. de Kooning was visiting someone out in the Hamptons, and the guy said, you know, here's some clay and here's some gloves. And he looked out the window and saw some guys working in the flats, the tidal flats, digging clams. So he produced a series of, I think it was 4 or 5 little tiny miniature, quick gestural sketches called the Clam Digger series. Mr. de Kooning's gallery was Xavier Foucault, and Mr. Foucault saw in those little pieces, something that potentially could be really beautiful, as monumental. And we went about the process of enlarging them to a middle stage, and then from a middle stage to the monumental stage. That's Vanessa there, giving a little bit of a sense of scale to the finished bronze. But that started out as something that wasn't much bigger than a paperweight. The enlarging process, a little bit later I'll talk about what it is now digitally. What Bruce had refined, Bruce is Vanessa's dad, what Bruce had refined was this, it was almost like a Jules Verne machine as compared to a Star Trek machine of scanners and lasers today. It was two rotating tables that had a relationship described and animated by a chain that connected them. The two tables would sit on different ends of a track of beams. The ratio was established as to how big you wanted the thing to be enlarged by how close those tables were and by the turning of those wheels. It's a little bit like when you're shifting gears on a bicycle. That was one element were the tables. The other element was a stylus. On the one end there was a point, and it would engage the model, which normally would be cast in something that you wouldn't mind scraping something over. So we would take an original bronze, make a mold over it, and cast a resin or a plaster. And a pointer would follow along that shape. And then through a series of bars and a boom, it would come out to another point that would be 3, 4, 5, whatever the ratio was, that much larger out into space. The whole thing sort of existed on a poetic level because you'd be scraping along here and it'd be describing something that didn't exist over here. The process was that you would basically pile stuff up to that point. That piling was usually a steel armature onto which was welded clips, onto which was bolted plywood ribs, onto which was stapled cardboard skin, onto which a pelt of clay was laid, until you were all the way out to that described point. And this was done thousands and thousands of times around the shape. Every time you moved the piece, it would define another point in space. At some point when the entire thing was more or less described, this pointer on this end was removed and a clay loop was put on. So that then now as the stylus will go over the form here, the clay loop will go into the clay and actually peel away, called a scraping. And you could either do a rough scraping or a fine scraping, depending upon how much refinement you wanted in the final piece. This is something that Bruce did on a level that exceeds craft, exceeds engineering, exceeds art. It was really an amazing thing. And he taught his daughter, Vanessa, how to do it at least as well. It was such an amazing thing to go into the studio and watch this large object appear. Where I really kind of got juiced up about the projects was when it came to the surface, the modeling. When you have a small object that's been modeled with hands and you have a thumbprint that's pushed into it, the energy of that thumbprint has to be translated that many times bigger. It's not just mathematics, there's poetry there. Is the mark that's been expressed by the thumbprint best expressed by a 2x4 being swung on the larger piece? It was trying to, how do you enlarge energy? How do you enlarge poetry? How do you make something that's not simply mathematically correct, but something that's aesthetically correct? That really got me going. I love that process. There were times when you'd look around the studio and you'd find the perfect tool was a wood saw. And you'd just go up to the sculpture and you'd drag it across the surface. Or you realize that if you picked up a ball of clay and pushed it on the surface, the little crumbs of it would stick, and then you could pat that down and you'd have the perfect texture of something that was completely unintended or unexpected in that original sketch. We did the de Koonigs. I think that was primarily where I was involved, was with the de Koonigs and the modeling, the mold making, the casting in resin, and then the bronzes were cast from that. an incredible experience. Mr. de Kooning was one of my favorite artists. I studied his painting in school, and the opportunity to actually have him come by and see the work that we were doing was a great honor. The polar opposite, or arithmetically opposite, would be miniaturization. This is an image of Jasper John's American flag. When the Statue of Liberty was being restored, it was determined that President Reagan would give sort of a presidential thank you of a bronze gold-plated casting of the American flag to Lee Iacocca and to the other big players in the project. The process was is that we needed to mold the painting itself, cast a resin of it, put it on the machine, but rather than enlarging it, we actually miniaturized it. Rather than it being a clay loop on one end, it got down to being a sewing needle. So you would actually be scraping along. It's really interesting to see these images and to think of the amount of time that went into making these objects, because after all of the scraping was done, you then had to go in and remove even the finest of tooling. There was so much hands-on in a world now where everything is being scanned and three-dimensionally printed or scanned and routed. To look back at this technology is really kind of interesting. I mentioned that thing about the difference between Jules Verne and Star Trek. Often if I'm confused by something, if I don't break it down to John Nagy's cones and spheres, I'll think about gardening or cooking, two favorites of mine. I think about cooking in terms of if you do a recipe and you're cutting, say you're dicing onions with a knife or you're dicing onions in the food processor. There's a quality, there's a difference there. There's something, they both cut it up, but there's something different. There's, folks who are audiophiles, they'll say, vinyl sounds so much better than digital recordings. People who like to print off film instead of printing off digitally for photography. I have a tremendous love for hand-scraped enlargements. And I don't know whether it's the object itself or what I know goes into it. But I am forever grateful. I keep doing the wrong thing here. I'm forever grateful to have been able to have worked on some of these things. In the studio, we were in Long Island City, and it was the old Exile nightclub. And downstairs, we had suspended a second floor, almost like a mezzanine like in here. I had a loft on one side, Bruce had a loft on the other side, and the big sort of atrium space between them is where the studio was. And it would not have been unusual at all to have, in this case, a life-size papier-mâché elephant that we were working on from the Metropolitan Museum to display an ornamental, I think it's called a huda. It's a saddle of sorts. And then to have the Ukrainian cathedral doors right next to it or alongside of it. It was a really kind of cool way to live, to get your coffee and to go downstairs and to work with this stuff. One of the big jobs, probably logistically difficult. Technically, it amounted to an enormous bump job in a way. It was on the Statue of Liberty. The crew here is Steve Simonak, Vanessa's in the middle, Jesus Figueroa, and a disturbingly young version of myself there. The face of the Statue of Liberty had experienced some distress over the years. Wherever there was a pocket in the copperwork or wherever there might have been a condensation that would build up through a freeze and thaw cycle, the copper would start to fatigue, and eventually there were ruptures in the skin of it. If you look at an older photograph, or even some you can still buy over Times Square of the Statue of Liberty, you might see on the tip of her nose a black spot, and it actually is a hole. The corners of the eyes, the tip of the nose, the earlobes, a couple ends of curls, and one or two spots on the drapery, I believe, were the majority of the difficulties that we were addressing. There were two crews. There was sort of the American crew that was working on the face, and then there was the French crew that was also working on the torch. I put in a couple of these pictures just because it's kind of cool to see. You don't usually get to see the Statue of Liberty in this perspective. On the upper left hand, ooh, wait, I forget. There you go, I got a laser. On the upper left, we're just securing the face, trying to keep anything that might possibly drop in terms of the chemicals that we were using to make the mold on any other part of the sculpture. In the upper right, we're applying rubber over the area that had been ruptured so that we could catch a perfect impression of it. The lower left, after the rubber is catalyzed, we build a plaster shell over it, and that holds everything in register so that when the shell comes off, the rubber's peeled away. The rubber sits back into the shell, and you have a perfectly registered impression of the damage. That was then repaired on the ground. A copper piece was made to replace it, brought back onto the scaffold, and then the area would be scribed out, and then the new replacement was put in. After a number of years of working with Vanessa and her dad, Vanessa was off to Australia for a while, and her dad went to the West Coast, and I opened my studio up over on Union Square on 17th Street. And I became very interested with doing architectural work, doing work on interiors, historic interiors. And I put up a couple of slides here showing some of the stuff that we were working on, coming up with painted details to replicate mosaics. That's my assistant, Derek Borowczyk, down there taking tiny little pieces of masking tape off of some gilding that then simulated mosaic work. And on the right-hand side is an actual mosaic that we did for some friends of ours, John and Irene, who are sitting in the front row here, where we actually were able to make the tiles themselves and then to create the image. Oops, too fast. There we go. We went through a whole series of studying how different gilding techniques were done, and also different painted techniques, how interiors were traditionally painted, but how to bring them back, how to coax them back from different levels of damage or misuse or of deterioration. I started to work more and more with historic architects. Ralph Harvard is a very, very gifted designer who works out of the city here, and he had a project down in Charleston. And we went down there with a crew to determine how best to paint the woodwork in this one house. It was built in 1810. The commission was to not fix anything and to not look like anything had been done, but to somehow unify it. So we started these processes of simple, very, very simple watercolor washes. We didn't use glazes because glazes built up too quickly. We were in the one room for 90 days with sable brushes and just slowly bathing the surface and then taking the color off, building it up, taking it off, so that the detail would come forward, but you were never aware that the artisans were there. We kept cracks in all the wood. We kept gravity cracks, settling cracks in all the plaster. It was considered part of the historic fabric and part of the language of the house. I liked that idea a lot, just working in that vocabulary of what was there, just trying to clean up the story a little bit. Here's a couple more images in that same house where we worked on it's called the mop base that goes around the room. This was the ballroom. This, I'm told, is the only interior room in Charleston in a private residence that's also a historic landmark, that you cannot change this room even though it's on the interior of a house. The frieze work and the cornices and the ceiling are from 1810. They were all picked clean with dental tools and then slowly bathed in colors that we had researched in roses and soft blues and ivory colors. We did a painted base around the room, which was traditional for the time, and did so in a way that simulated the marble without sort of slavishly copying it. The whole idea was to just have a gracious kind of coaxing back of the room. And these were medallions on the ceilings that had to be researched, resculpted, restored, regilded, painted. This was one of my favorite projects. It was right on, I think it's called Church Street in Charleston. It was a couple of years ago now. but the light that came through the windows was the most amazing filtered light. And the reason it took so many days is that from day to day, I'd go in and I'd give a wash of color. The next day, the weather would change, and it would change the color. So you kept going back and forth, trying to get that medium where it was absolutely perfect. It kind of goes back to the origami papers, like just wanting it to be exactly right. And it really, it was a challenge, but it was a great job. It was an amazing thing to work on. I, at the same time, began working on historic wallpapers. So the company Zuber started in, I think it was 1837 in Alsace. They printed, this is called The Views of North America. And this is from a room that's uptown here. John D. Rockefeller put the money aside to do the receiving room for the president's receiving room at the International House, which is associated with Columbia University. The wallpaper was installed in the 20s, and at the time the wallpaper was varnished. They would varnish it so that they could clean it. The kind of paints that were used in the publishing of these papers was incredibly water soluble. They were distempers, almost like temper paints, so that if you spattered them with water, they would run, they would bleed, they would do all sorts of nasty things. So the idea was if they put shellac on it, that would seal the surface. The shellac over a number of years turned a very deep amber. Then on top of that, the nicotine smoke from all of the receptions that were held in the room made the entire room almost black. So the commission was just to go in and to bring it back to life. This is an after picture, after everything's been cleaned up. The before pictures in the, in here you can see somebody came along and they actually took spick and span and they scrubbed the wallpaper thinking that that would take care of the job. It actually dissolved it. Over here you can see the deep, deep, deep smoke staining that came. There was also a fireplace in the room that they used pretty often. We went through a whole series of different experiments as to how best to clean it, and it came down to realizing that that little sort of yellow ochre block of the art gum eraser turned out to be the absolute perfect thing. So we went through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of erasers. Myself and a small crew, I think we spent 5 months erasing the surface. Very, very carefully, determining what areas were fatigued, what areas had to be re-glued, what areas had to be rebuilt completely. There were some areas where entire pieces of paper were missing. Some areas that were smaller, but the sheets were published in about an 18-inch strip. And what we'd have to do would go back and research the pattern, recreate it, find the right paper, repaint the paper, distress the paper, and sometimes we would actually subject the painted paper to smoke, clean the smoke off of it so that it matched the smoke. So we had to destroy the restoration in order to restore the restoration. This is that finished panel, where we are actually able to recreate the whole of Boston Harbor. Okay, and we were able to complete Natural Bridge, which is over here. It was a very challenging project. We did a whole series of these. We did, I think, 3 different sets of these in 3 different residences. They were published. One piece arrived at the studio in 6 garbage bags. It was in a house in Maine, and there was a fire, and the fire company came and they used water. So a crew was sent in with scraping knives, and they took putty knives and they scraped through the wallpaper and put it into garbage bags. And it arrived in the studio. We spent 4 months putting the pieces of paper back together. Then we put another 4 months into cleaning it, and then another 4 months into repainting it. And I'm told that they have enough value to support that kind of investment. This is the fireplace wall in that same room. There was a whole area that was missing its paper entirely, and there was a not so successfully done adaptation of the paper, which it was determined should come off. And we were commissioned to go back in and to recreate in the style of Zuber the completion of the mural cycle. The right-hand side here is just a little bit further in the progression than the left-hand side. This is a combination of several of the different scenes of North America. This is a combination of Natural Bridge, New York Harbor, Boston Harbor, and the views from West Point. We took a little bit of each to create something that kind of unified the rest of the structure. In the spirit of kind of telling stories, there's my friend John and Irene. John was you were in Prague at the time, right? In Poland. And John had brought back a book from his trip, and it was of a young artist who worked extensively, I believe, on the cathedral. And he had done a series of wallpaper designs that had never been completed. And in their house in the Hudson Valley, we decided that it would be kind of neat to finish someone's story that hadn't been completed. So we went about taking a small sketch from the original and then reproducing the pattern, finding out where the repeat was, and then creating it. In this case, rather than publishing it on paper, all of the walls were hand-painted so that it had the character of something that had been there for a very long time. This is, to the right, is an adaptation of the same paper with Morning Glories. And to the left is a coffered ceiling that we designed to accentuate some of the colors and also to bring some of the architecture back into the space. You can see the paper behind a Fortuny lamp, and then to the right, just sort of in context, it's a very eclectic kind of house, and I think the paper works kind of nicely there. At this point, I had been working with Amy Perlin up on Lexington Avenue. She was the antique dealer who was doing a lot of these paper jobs. And catty corner from Amy's shop was a little storefront, and in the storefront was there was a Giacometti lamp that I thought was beautiful. And I went in, and there was a gentleman whose name is Eugenia Luchesi, who was about 90 years old when I met him. And his grandfather had started a plaster casting business in Manhattan. This is a catalog from the 20s, and the shop was at one point on 59th Street. At this point, he was up in the 60s on Lexington Avenue. Over a series of a number of weeks and then months of just dropping in and saying hi to Mr. Luchesi, he'd show me this project or that project. And he started to tell me a little bit about how he was sad that he didn't have any children to pass the business on to. And finally he said that he was thinking about hiring a dumpster and having the basement cleaned out. And I asked, well, Mr. Luchesi, what's in the basement? And he said several hundred plaster piece molds. And a plaster piece mold is a really amazing object. It's something from another time. Usually, if you have a piece of plaster cast now, it's being cast from a rubber mold. So it's basically like an Easter bunny, where you'll see a parting line that goes right down the middle of it, and the rubber peels away from it. A plaster piece mold proceeds using rubber molds. It means that every undercut, every texture, every draft, every compound turn has to have a separate plug that pulls away in a separate direction. And that each of those has to interlock so that when they're held in register in the mold and then inverted so plaster can be poured into it, that they don't collapse into that interior space. They are amazing three-dimensional puzzles. And the thought of these things going into a landfill was it just couldn't happen. And I decided that I'd show you a couple of these things. On the left-hand side here, this is a plaster piece mold. This is of an 18th century sculpture. It's a terracotta called the Maiden of Lille. On the right, I'm taking off the back of it to expose the interior portion here, but each of these individual sections has to be disassembled in a certain sequence for them to come off of a casting and then assembled in the reverse to create the cavity to pour the next casting. These, to me, were like geodes. They were like absolutely gorgeous objects. Some of them, the exterior of them, because plaster is dripped around the outside, are just encrusted. They're just these rough shapes. But then you open them up, and the varnishes have gone garnet red. They've been waxed. They've been oiled. The surface of the mold is just lovingly cared for because it describes the object. I could not let them go, so I said, Mr. Luchesi, I'll take them, and I now have them. I have hundreds of them, and I have impressions off of Abraham Lincoln's hands, the death masks of Supreme Court justices, journeyman molds from all around the world. They are incredible. Some of them are beyond use, and some of them are almost as good as new. But they are beautiful, beautiful objects. There's a certain sense of stewardship and maybe a little bit of obsessiveness that I have about them. But that brings me to this slide here. A number of years ago, I had moved to a new apartment, and I was having the hardest time unpacking my boxes. I could not get around to doing it, and I was living out of a couple of things, and I had an exhibition that was coming up, and I didn't have anything for it either. And I decided that what I really should do is I should do a drawing of everything I owned, and it would obligate me to open the boxes. And I literally opened a box, took the thing out, put it on the piece of paper, traced it, and put it where it was supposed to go. And I did this for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And actually, when I look at this, it's really, there are, right here, these are bottles that I hadn't returned for the deposit yet. There are suit jackets. There is literally everything I owned, right down to paper clips. This thing is about 40 feet long, and then it wraps around the room a couple of times. The reason I bring it up is that someone pointed out to me that the difference between a hoarder and a collector is that a collector puts it in boxes and labels it. I started, with Mr. Luchesi's molds, I started to really get fascinated by bits and pieces of sculpture that were just kind of sitting around that didn't have a home. Literally bits and pieces, but things that I thought were far, far, far too good to let go. Tiny jewelry findings, pieces of ironwork. And the only way I could think of doing it was that I would take these cardboard trays, and with hot glue I'd make compartments and I'd put these things in it. I have many, 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 many boxes like this. And I didn't know what to do with it. But back, I don't know, maybe in the mid-90s, word got around that I had these boxes and that there was this guy with this collection. And all of a sudden, architects and designers and photographers started showing up at the studio on Union Square looking for props or for inspiration. And it started to become sort of this archive of objects. And I liked that. I used it that way myself. I always felt that these things were just waiting for the project to kind of happen to them. One of the people that came by the studio was a guy named John Roccasalva. He was the head visual merchandiser for Tiffany and Company, and his boss was Robert Ruffino. And they started coming by and thought that maybe there was something that I had that they might like. And they started to commission me to do windows for them. The windows that we did, I didn't know this at the time. If I knew it at the time, I might have been a lot more nervous about it, but Tiffany's had a tradition of, for their holiday windows, of commissioning artists. And they commissioned me for a series of 6 seasons. Prior to myself, Jean Moore did them. Prior to Jean Moore, it was Robert Rauschenberg and Andy Warhol. And had I known that at the time, I would have been a lot more nervous. But I jumped in on it, and one of the things that I tried to do was, since they were little theater sets in and of themselves, and sort of the ultimate in storytelling, to try to use as many humble materials as I could to put into the Tiffany window. And at the studio at 41 Union Square, there was always a dumpster full of cardboard and packing materials and stuff, and I always tried to see how much of the Tiffany windows I could build out of the dumpster. And it's amazing how much I did. That's Peeve the cat, the best cat in the world. On the left, there's the plaster sculpture of him in the center, and there he is in gold in the windows for the first Christmas season that I did. Sitting on top of Peeve's head is the setting that Jean Schlumberger had designed for the Tiffany diamond. That's not the Tiffany diamond. That's not allowed to be in the windows. That's a citrine of the same carat weight as the Tiffany diamond. With anything that we did, it was always back to sort of that beginning of sketches, drawings, paintings, drawings, origami paper. Is this the right one? Is this not the right one? This was a plum pudding that we did in the first season. We had a plum pudding. We had Peeve the cat. We had a sterling silver monkey unwrapping a present, a swan, and the Christmas angel. These windows, I love doing these windows. These were so fun to do. We would start with, it would start in June, where we would present the sketches, and then we'd work through the entire summer. And at that time, we were unveiling on November the 18th. Now they unveil the same night as the lights lit up on the Christmas tree at Rockefeller Center. These windows here, rather than being cast in whatever was in the dumpster, we actually started to do them in fiberglass so that they had a little bit more structure and that I could play around a little bit more with things that were anti-gravity. This is a window here. This is actually one of my favorite windows that we ever did. The story behind this is the mermaid has taken a fishing net that was intended to catch her and unwoven it and has now made stockings for her kids. One of the cool things about working on the Tiffany windows is that I had pretty much free reign as to what I wanted to do up to a certain point. And we explored different materials. We were using clay, we were using plaster, and one year we decided that you kind of need to use sugar. And Colette Peters, who has Colette Cakes down in the village, I hired her to work with me, and we designed Christmas trees and spent literally months of making sugar flowers and royal icing, and we would ice these cakes, and that's what was in the windows that year. You can see there's these diamond insects. There's a diamond dragonfly with a pearl, all these little diamond pins. My big concern was that in the morning I would go and there would be insects, but they wouldn't be jewelry. So every morning during that holiday season, I would go from the studio on Union Square, I'd take the train up, and I'd go right across and I'd walk across the windows just to make sure there was nothing crawling in them, and then I'd go back to the studio. I was glad when they came down. This was the same season. We wanted to use gingerbread, but we used masonite instead, and then royal icing. So all of the shapes were done in royal icing. And this was another winter. This is sort of a classic example of do not do this at home. The back of all of these things was to appear to be sheets of ice. And the only way that I could figure out of making a convincing sheet of ice that wouldn't melt under the lights was to take huge sheets of polypropylene and hang them in my studio, and then mix up buckets of catalyzed resin and then throw them against the sheets. And as they dripped and set up, they were very, very thin, and I could peel the polypropylene off the back of them, and then they would hang, and they were pretty convincing sheets of ice. We did a whole series of special event windows. These are plaster pieces that were done for a 4th of July. And then we started to get more and more into working on specific objects. The problem, or the challenge with jewelry is that the jewelry is always so very, very small. And a window, even as small as it is a huge space when you put a little piece of jewelry into it. So we started to get more and more commissions to create sculptures or venues for a piece of jewelry to exist that gave them a sense of scale and presence. This is a piece that was designed for Diana Vreeland by Jean Schlumberger. And the Tiffany Archives reacquired it for their collection, and it was incredibly delicate. The little fringe coming off the coat of arms was incredibly delicate. There was enamel, sapphires, gold, diamonds, rubies, and emeralds. and it was one of the most requested pieces for traveling exhibitions. So we were asked to come up with a way of creating a secure, basically a time capsule, so that it could be shown all around the world, but it would never have to leave its box. So we came up with an idea of machining out of a solid ingot of stainless steel this time capsule in which this thing now exists. My friend Tracy Strong, who's a paper artist, started to work with us on a lot of Tiffany projects to create traveling boxes that the objects would come in. And we started to get really involved in the idea that the way a thing is presented is the way a thing is treated. So rather than to have something just arrive in foam, to have it arrive in a fitted box gave it all the more presence. So Tracy came up with these amazing boxes that would collapse and expose the objects inside of them. It was really fun to work on those things. Louis Comfort Tiffany was a big proponent of American gemstones. He had sort of, as a painter, he was fascinated with colors. And as a jeweler, he was fascinated with anything that gave him the color he was looking for. So rather being bound to sort of the classic precious palette of stones and metals, he would be very open to the idea of working with steel or working with copper or working with an American gemstone. He did pieces with Mississippi freshwater pearls that were just incredible. We decided that when we were doing some exhibition designs of the Tiffany, Louis Comfort Tiffany's work, that we would sort of go outside of the velvet form and we would start to work kind of in the way that we think he might have designed an exhibition. So I started to work more with cherry woods and polishes and silks to do the mounts, to give them a little bit of a different presence to them, but also to showcase the objects. We started to create these little architectural forms and use the jewelry almost as people, to populate the cases with the jewelry outside the context of how they might necessarily have been worn as jewelry. This is a vinaigrette here, and it's a Favril glass vinaigrette, very, very delicate, and it had to travel, so we sewed it into a little box that Tracy then made doors like hurricane shutters that came over it so that the whole thing could come to the venue and then open up and display the piece. On the lower area there, that's the Wade family necklace, and it's one of Tiffany's sort of crown jewels. And that traveled many, many times, and we spent hours and hours and hours with fly fishing lines sewing every single stone down to the form so that nothing would be damaged, but nothing would move either. This is an exhibit that was done for the Forbes magazine, the Forbes gallery I think the exhibition was the colors of Louis Comfort Tiffany, and it celebrated his different individual pieces that he had designed. Right about this time, I had spent so much time working on exhibitions and traveling exhibitions and the windows for Tiffany's that they gave me the commission to come up with some designs that would be the worldwide standard for the company, so that whenever a jewel was presented, whether it was in New York, Kuala Lumpur, or Beijing, it would be done on a standardized palette of forms. So we spent the next year coming up with a series of still life shapes. I didn't want to simply have neck forms and hands. We wanted to create still lifes in the case so that every time you saw a piece, it was in the context of these forms. That a pearl necklace could be draped over something, in something, around something. A ring could be nested in something. And these were shapes that were done in plaster, sanded, polished, lacquered, polished, sanded, polished, molded, then cast in resin, then sanded and polished and lacquered, plated in palladium, and then varnished and sanded and polished. And we did thousands of them. This is a rocket ship that I sculpted in bronze. And I figured if I got this far in the talk and this came on the screen and I hadn't keeled over and nobody was snoring, that it would be nice to just look at something that I liked. So this is like a bookmark for me. This is a chance for me to catch my breath. This piece, I did this at the time when they decided to decommission the last of the space shuttles. And being a kid of the 50s and 60s, the space program was like a huge thing. I mean, the moon shots and all that. And I thought it would be kind of cool to do my own rocket ship. So we did this, and it's entitled When Last We Dreamt. And I hope we see rockets again someday. After a number of years of working with white cotton gloves and security cameras and microns and grams and carats and taking tweezers to get tiny pieces of hairs off stuff, I was so ready to work with something big and physical again that when I had the opportunity to work on the memorial, the Korean Memorial for the city of New York, I jumped at it. Bill Crozier is a friend of Vanessa and mine. We've worked on his pieces for years and years and years. He received the commission from the city of New York, and he asked if I would collaborate on it, if I would do the plinth that the soldier's standing on, and the memorial wall that's carrying the names, and then the mountaintop that's on top of that. The upper left-hand corner is our original maquette that was done. Going back to the enlarging conversation, this is sort of, Bill really sculpts in the 19th century. He's very intentional, very slow sculptor, an amazing figurative sculptor. He always sculpts at full scale. So he would go from his original sketch and he would just simply make it as big as it was going to be. So the piece was not, in fact, enlarged. It was sculpted at full scale, which meant rather than scraping and being fastidious about creating the forms, we could actually bang the thing out at huge scale. We used tons of clay. And the act of piling the clay on, ripping it apart, tearing it, walking on it, he wanted the terrain to have this tremendous amount of energy. And we created the surfaces by pushing and pulling and ripping and tearing and banging. And it was incredible. It was like such a great antidote to all the fastidiousness of the Tiffany work. The monument is depicting a particular mountain range in Korea where this special unit of medics was working. And the configuration, topography of those mountains are such, they call them razorbacks, where the mountainsides would come very, very tight to a very tight little ridge. And they couldn't carry wounded soldiers down on either side because the footing wasn't good. So they had to carry on the ridge, which put the medics and the company that was protecting them at even higher risk because it put them in high silhouette to the sky. The gentleman who commissioned this piece, and then eventually it became the city of New York, and then the State Department, and then the South Korean government got into it, they had made a promise to a group of men from Queens who had died that they would tell this story. And the memorial wall, which is being worked on the lower right-hand side there, bears the names of those people who passed. It was a tremendous privilege to work on something like this. This is the first time I actually ever got into digital technology at all. Since the roster of names was so long, the idea of having to carve all of the names and keep everything in register was just unrealistic. So I worked with a company that was able to produce the letters in relief, or in carved relief, digitally. We printed them. We three-dimensionally printed them. But I wasn't comfortable with the idea. It didn't seem, there was a certain dignity that I thought was lacking in doing that. I wanted to somehow do honor to each of the names, spend time with each of the names. So we took these plastic sheets that had the letters on them, and then we heated the clay, and we brushed the clay into all the letters. And then we carved the clay back out again, so that each name, we very much spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about that name, thinking about that person, thinking about why it needs to be something other than just a reproduction of a name. This was a great honor to work on that project. I get back to talking about textures, and these are 3 different areas, no 3, what is that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different images of different textures that are on the sculpture itself, everything from very extreme to something that's very delicate. And the texture of clay is really an amazing thing. How it grabs light. If you model in a certain way, you can make clay feel like velvet. If you model in a different way, you can make it feel like shards of glass. And it's all in the manipulation of the same material. I'm going to bring up another image here that's a little out of, this is, actually, it's not, this is in sequence. This is the names themselves, on the left in clay and on the right in the bronze. And then this is the piece. This is actually one of the gentlemen who commissioned and made us keep the promise. And you can see the mountaintop and the receding and the figures going up to the silhouette. This is a slide of something that I wanted to introduce at this point. Vanessa and I are working on a project called the American Artist's Hands Project. And what gets me so excited about this project is it's kind of exists on 2 different planes. These are the hands of very prominent, very well-known sculptors whose work is on the level of icon, that at a certain point in their career, it was Vanessa's idea that we should make the molds over the hands of these artists and to use it as document and to ask them questions about their hands and to ask them questions about their process and to create these objects in an archive. I am completely excited about that. I'm also excited about the notion that a person spends an entire lifetime working with a material, affecting a material, trying to create a shape, trying to create a sculpture. At some point, that material affects the person. And these objects, these hands, these textures are the result of a lifetime of involvement with a material. And I find that extremely exciting. To look at the different effects that the skin has taken, to me, is as exciting as seeing a well-modeled surface on a sculpture. I started at this point to work more and more in terms of the storytelling with architects and designers. I've been getting commissions with architects who want me to respond to projects just purely as a sculptor, how textures are used, how volumes are used, and how details are used. More and more I work with folks in historic districts where they're trying to create a space that's consistent with something that's already there or something that is complementary to something that's next to it. We've worked a lot in the Hudson Valley area. One of the projects was to do an entire city block in the town of Cold Spring. It was a fairly controversial project. It was an old lumber yard, and we had to recreate the architecture of the area without trying to become a Disneyland version of it. The idea was to frame the views rather than to occupy them so that the entire community could enjoy it. And that takes me to what I'm going to call sort of my case study. This is a project that's kind of near and dear to my heart. This is a field across from a cemetery in the town that I grew up in. And it's a very small town in Michigan. It's a farming community. And the cemetery had been there for about 150 years, and it was full. And they wanted to expand the cemetery to the field next to it, but they didn't quite know how to make it be not the new field. You know, they wanted people to be buried there that had the same sense of community as to the old cemetery. So the idea was to commission a sculpture that would be the center point for this expansion. The parish was the parish of St. Michael, so the obvious choice was an image of St. Michael. Since it was the town that I grew up in, I knew that I had to kind of come up with something that would speak to the folks that live there, and something that belonged, something that didn't come from a catalog. So in the spring of 3 years ago, every spring out in the middle of a field, there's a service where the local ministers bless the seed for the next season. And I met in the tractor barn, and there was about 50 farmers there. And I asked them if, when they were raking their fields that spring, that when they collected the stones from the heave that happens every winter, that they bring them to the cemetery site. And I thought that what we would do is we would build the base out of stones from farms that came from the community, so that it actually belonged to the people. With any project, there's just reams and reams and reams and reams of sketches. Here, I started to come up with this idea of almost like a wedding cake base for the angel, and it turned out to be 3 tiers and about 5,000 stones, and we got stones from farms from all around the county. And we collected these rocks that would heave, and then had the local masons set them in place. The image of St. Michael, I didn't want to do a statue that was something that you would see on a holy card or from a saint's book. I wanted to do something that belonged specifically to this town called Port Austin. Its primary crop was corn, and the biggest farmer of corn was Mrs. Emke, and Mrs. Emke's corn grew all the way around where my house was. So I decided that I would have St. Michael kind of morph out of a stand of corn. So the sculpture grows from corn, standing on top of a grindstone. 5 miles away was the world's largest quarry for the production of grindstone. And then the statue grows from that. This is the small maquette model, the 3-foot model. It's done in plastiline clay, and then I was preparing, this is my first foray into the digital enlargement world. Because of the timeline, we decided that we would try that. I cut all of the pieces off, all of the little appendages that had to be cut off so that they could be molded individually, cast in resin, scanned digitally, and reproduced in foam. And this was my learning curve. I came to find that I didn't need to cut off everything, that the computer actually knows how to do that. That you can tell the scanner what you want cut off, and they'll scan around it, which is completely different than anything I'd ever known, and it's really quite amazing. These images here, obviously the wing's been taken off, the arm with the sword's been taken off, and the mold has been made here so that the resin can be cast. When the resin was cast and digitally scanned, it was done down, John Lash at Digital Atelier in Princeton did it. They put the object on a turntable, spun it around, a laser light read it. The information went by a wire to a clean room where 8 engineers were at monitors interpreting the information, and then telling a router in another room to cut it out of a huge block of styrofoam. The picture in the middle is part of that foam. Because we had a tight timeline on this, I had to work on the face first. So they said, no problem, we'll just route the face first. And they were able to deliver the object to me in perfectly fitted parts. So I could do the face, I could do the arm, I could bring them all back, and they fit within a 32nd of an inch of each other. It was an amazing thing to see. The center picture there, after the masons were done building the base for the sculpture, that was the first time that we actually had the exact dimension of what the bottom of the sculpture was supposed to be. they were able to fax to me a plot of that, and I was able to fax that to the digital atelier, and they were able to tell the router to cut it exactly within a 1/16 of an inch. It was an amazing thing to see. Once the entire thing was enlarged and put together, I heated up plastiline to sort of the consistency of warm peanut butter and painted it onto the surface because I still wanted to go in and sculpt it. A router can't reach up, in, and under, so sometimes the deepest cuts are smoothed over. So what I would do is go in with a knife and cut out the deep parts, fill it with clay, and then sculpt out the detail that I wanted. Sculpture House Casting, they used to be on 26th Street, they're in Long Island City now. They molded the full-scale sculpture, and then they cast it in a bonded bronze, which is basically bronze powder that's been ground to a fine dust, suspended in resin, and then that's painted into flexible molds. So that you have a very, very durable, weather-resistant, much less expensive, much lighter final casting. And the final casting, this is Sal over at Sculpture House, was patinated with acids on the bronze powder and then pigmented on top of it. And this is the final piece on the right hand here. The corn is coming to the left. He's standing on the shores of Michigan on top of a grindstone. His sword is actually a cleverly disguised lightning rod since he's out in the middle of a cornfield. That's Gene Clancy. He's been around forever. He had a boom truck and lowered the thing in place. And the final piece just stands in silhouette against the sky. The first people have started to be buried around it. And since I had the opportunity to orient the piece whichever way I wanted, my mom had just passed away. And her grave is right where Michael's looking. And it was really interesting because I was talking to my sister about talking here tonight. And you know, I said I was going to talk about the St. Michael statue. And she said, well, you know what day it is, don't you? And I said, no, I didn't really. And I realized that, that tomorrow is actually the 2nd anniversary of Ma's passing. So it was kind of neat to have this image here and to tell that story. You know, I think the one thing that I wanted to get across was why I decided to do what I do. And that was what that working title was about originally. The only thing that I can come up with that's satisfactory is that by being an artist, by being an artisan, by being a craftsman, when I take on a project, when I tell a story, it helps me to define and describe just a little section of the arc of the time that I have here. And somehow I think that's important. There's an expression that you cannot worry a flower without troubling a star. You know, what Vanessa was talking about in her really generous introduction about tweaking things. I think it's incredibly important to deliberate, to select, to ask the questions, is this right? Can it be better? Can I say this better? Did I tell the story? Is there more story to tell? Did I do justice to the story? And that's kind of what I do. I hope that tells you a little bit about what I am as an artisan, a craftsman. I hope it wasn't too windy. I'm just incredibly grateful for having been given the gift to take some time off and to think about what I do and try to share it. So thank you very much.
Thomas? Thomas, I would like to thank you on behalf of the General Society for a fascinating lecture and for showing us your absolutely exquisite work. It was utterly fabulous. Thank you so much for sharing it with us.
To add to Karen's word, we have this certificate that we'd like to share, to give you and honor you, and as well as a library membership to General Society. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. That's beautiful.
Yes. I want to thank you all so much for attending this evening on this bitterly cold night. And I would suggest that you join us now for a glass of wine and cheese, and perhaps any questions you have, you can speak to Thomas personally. But again, on behalf of the General Society, Thomas, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation.